Hey everyone, it's Jessica Margatish, also known as Jam for those of you that have worked with me for multiple years. I just completed the LinkedIn product management course for building a product strategy. You can see my tiny little comments on how the class was and what I'd recommend for it linked also in this message, but I wanted to highlight a couple points that were brought up in that session that I think are going to be super important and very easy, unfortunately, to overlook the importance of. So those two things are, one, bringing people along and getting buy-in throughout the process. So it isn't just about a tangible plan or strategy that you create, it's about how you get it done. And the second point being, it's okay to change direction. And I know even the best planned strategies or plans will need to be adjusted. Things change, assumptions can be proven wrong, new information is always becoming available. Failure is not in changing the direction, but rather ignoring the indicators that tell you that you should make a change. So just really learning and getting comfortable with not holding on too tightly to your original plan. So today, in this video specifically, I'll only be talking about the first point, the bringing people along and getting buy-in throughout the process. There's going to be a part 2 of this video coming out shortly, and that's going to dig deeper into the changing direction aspect and how to really plan for that. Now, obviously, before getting into either of these topics, I acknowledge that both of these statements are not rocket science at all. They're very simple, they're very easy to take for granted, and it personally took me many years to appreciate these concepts really as much as I do today, and building on both of them in order to really incorporate them into my own personal standard operating practices. So, getting into buying in and really bringing people along in the process, I think it might be most pertinent to start talking about pitfalls and my own personal pitfalls in achieving this. So for the first one, I have 2 identified. The first one is, previously I used to be very black and white or analytical in my thinking. And that can be a good thing, but also in my mind, everything could really be boiled down into a specific equation if you had the right inputs. And what I mean by that is, if A plus B equaled C, then obviously, in my mind, I would think everybody would follow the logic that C is what we're supposed to do. Just because it's a logical flow, I thought everybody would kind of follow along with me in that reasoning and understand, oh, C is what we need to move forward with. But what I didn't take into account was, just because something's logical doesn't mean people are following the same thought process. They're not necessarily arriving at the same conclusions. And some people might need a little bit more information or a little more support in getting to that conclusion. So a lot of people fall victim to this, I would say, for a variety of reasons. It could be how you were raised, it could be neurodivergence, it could be that you've worked in an industry primarily for years and years and years that really values that kind of like black and white mindset of A plus B equals C, and that's it. That could be more of a mathematical industry. It could be more on the medical industry, but that is something to think about. Even though something is so clear to you, it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's getting there in the same way. So you really need to take people along step by step in that journey and make sure everybody's arriving at C, at that final conclusion. Now, secondly, and it's kind of strange to mention and talk about, but overconfidence bias is something that I think a lot of us experience, but don't necessarily talk about. And it comes with a negative connotation of overconfidence, so overzealous, always thinking that either your thought process is better, your solution's better. And I think this is something that's inherent to a lot of people, whether we admit it or not. But it's also something that I think as soon as you acknowledge it and you see that something's been challenged year over year and you're like, oh, maybe I don't know everything. Maybe I can't be everything to everyone. Good advice both in work and in life. But there's a reason for a division of labor. There's a reason for specialization in labor. And, obviously, as you're developing a solution, as you're getting inputs and everything, you can't, as any one person, understand all the angles. You need support. You need additional feedback. You need to go out and interview people. You need that diversity of thought and diversity of background that is going to be essential for making sure that your product or your final solution is solid and it's going to resonate out there with users. No matter how great you are, how much experience you have, there's absolutely no way that any one person is going to bring all of those perspectives together to make a seamless experience. So those were a couple of my kind of pitfalls that I've fallen into in the past, and I think that are really, really good to resonate on and think about and make sure that, you're avoiding them as systematically as possible. Now, question is, how do you avoid them? How do you make sure you're bringing people along? And I have a couple things that are really the tips and tricks of the trade that I've learned over the years. Now, if you're in a meeting and you're just reading out the conclusion of what you've decided and how you're going to move forward, you're either sitting in one of two scenarios. One is you've already got alignment, buy-in, you're moving forward, and basically you're just sitting in a status update meeting. Or the second scenario of you are in a room of very disengaged leaders and stakeholders, and that is a completely separate issue that we won't be getting into today. So basically, if you're sitting there reading out a conclusion, it is not appropriate for any stage prior to already having buy-in and moving forward on execution. You need to be bringing people along. You need to have those points of approval along the way. And I've seen people do this in a lot of different ways. I've seen a lot of product managers kind of fly by the seat of their pants and see who reaches out to them and who wants to be involved in the process, but I like to be a bit more structured about this. I like to intentionally solicit feedback and communicate effectively through the process. So first, in order to do this, to me, I like going through the exercise at the very beginning of any initiative and figuring out who are going to be my stakeholders, who are the people I need to engage with that need to be brought along for the process, and what do they contribute in the process. So that can be stakeholders that are going to inform your actual solution design. So these are going to be people that can provide meaningful feedback. So this will be in the discovery and design phases. They could be actual end users of the product. They could be internal POCs that can provide trend information or kind of additional structured information on those end users. They're going to be largely people that are going to inform what you're actually building and give inputs in determining exactly how to look at it. The second is going to be functional points of contact. And this is primarily going to be internal unless you're working obviously with external partners and so on and so forth in more of a B2B space. But essentially for the functional POCs, these are going to be the people you need to tap into cross-functionally that are going to help launch the product down the line. So this is going to be like the marketing team, it's going to be customer support, it's going to be making sure that everything is set in place in order to get it out to market. And some of these stakeholders could also be people that are informing the process. Customer support could see issues and you're working on resolving those. Marketing could see different things out in industry and say, hey, this is a problem to solve. Both of those areas are just examples of functional internal. It doesn't mean that they're only informing the product launch. They could also be contributing to your actual solution design. Thirdly, and obviously very importantly, are your decision makers. These are the people, potentially it's the CEO, the ultimate decision maker. It could be other leaders in your organization. These people are going to be like final sign off. You need their support in order to move forward. And fourth, and I think most often overlooked, are the influencers to the decision makers. So these are people, it could be somebody that's been around and worked with the decision maker for a long time, and they really appreciate their input. So anytime a big decision needs to be made, they'll kind of reach out and put their feelers out and say, hey, what do you think of this? And that influencer then can kind of steer the decision maker in certain ways. So it's always good when you're in an industry to figure out who those influencers of the decision makers are, even if they're not specifically the person making the decision themselves. And it's good to kind of hit them earlier in the process before you even get to the point of talking to the decision maker. And we'll get a little bit more into that later. Next, one thing I really like to do is mapping out my engagement in the process. So this is going to be identifying who to engage with out of that list of stakeholders that you've just made, and when you're going to engage with them, putting more of a timetable around it and baking it into your process. So I know every product manager is going to go through and say, okay, I'm in discovery, I'm eliciting this feedback, I'm doing this, we're looking at these metrics, we're going into design, this is how we're going about design, I'm talking to UI, I'm talking to back end, then we get into execution, and those phases are already baked into any product process. This is taking it a step further and saying, I can't go for final review of a solution until I have spoken with X, Y, and V functional stakeholders to get input. So it might change your final solution if you elicit advice from them or feedback from them. So what this could look like is saying, if you need a final review by T-32, I like doing T- in weeks. So you have your launch, you go a week before launch is T-1, 32 weeks before launch is T-32. Obviously, this is on a grand scale that I'm illustrating. But for example, if final review needs to happen in that working backwards times table at T-32 weeks before launch, then you need to start making those conversations for functional sign-off and feedback at, say, T-35. So 3 weeks prior to you needing to be in final review, because you've decided that you're going to need those 3 weeks to have those conversations, get that feedback, incorporate what you think was beneficial, and then realign with those stakeholders to get their feedback. Now, as far as actually sitting and getting feedback with those stakeholders, there's 2 different approaches I've seen for getting buy-in, and I'll call them a big bang or a piece by piece. And that is, you can either pull all of the stakeholders that you could possibly need feedback or sign off from into one big meeting and duke it out over a period of time, or you can do the piece by piece, which is going to each individual stakeholder, getting their feedback and alignment separately before pulling everybody back together to receive that ultimate buy-in. Personally, I like the piece by piece method. I think it can be more successful for a couple different reasons. One is that stakeholder might be more comfortable sharing information in a less formal, more one-to-one format. So they'll be able to really share more of their perspective unhindered by the group's perspective that's around them. They might share more information, they might share different information. It's just better to get, I would say, a more upfront view and feedback in that type of format. Also, and it's kind of awful to say, but there are some personalities, and I'm sure we've all seen it in the workforce, where some people, I say, they like to peacock. They like to kind of show off or show themselves as more assertive in a group setting rather than being more constructive and conversational in an individual setting. So just managing different people's personalities, I think, is much easier initially in a one-on-one. And then you can bring the broader meeting together with multiple stakeholders, all of those stakeholders, for a more formal final sign-off. And that meeting, by the time you get to that bigger, broader meeting, should go much smoother because everybody in the room already feels intimately familiar and much more comfortable with what you're proposing, and they all feel as though they've been heard. So typically you can avert a big opposition in those bigger structure meetings after you've had these little individual sessions with each of the stakeholders first. Now, there's two big points, I would say, for really getting sign off in these types of sessions. One, and it's incredibly important, is you need to tailor your pitch and your conversation to exactly what matters to that stakeholder. So for example, your decision maker, say it's your CEO or a different leader in the company, they're likely not going to care about a specific decision you've made to change the font to some different color and how you've arrived to that decision. your user experience point of contact might, but the CEO won't. The CEO doesn't need all the nitty-gritty details of how they've arrived to a decision. They care about the money. They care about the return on their investment. How much is this going to cost? What's the return? What's the time? What are the assumptions we've made? And how do we track that we're actually meeting towards that, and how do we adjust as needed? So each of the individual stakeholders will have different goals in mind. They all sit in different parts of the company. They all have different responsibilities. They all have different KPI metrics that they need to follow. You need to make sure that you're actually representing information to them in a way that they understand, for one, and in a way that they care. So you need to appeal to them and convey the most relevant information to them. And prior to actually going into that session with them, map it out. Make sure that you have an understanding, at least from your own perspective, of what you think that they care about. Generally you'll be correct, but I also like in the very beginning of those sessions, you sit down with your user experience point of contact and you say, hey, before we get started and before I start diving into this, I want to just validate that these are the things that you care most about, so I can make sure to hit them throughout this conversation. And I'm then respecting your time. I'm being very intentional, and you can get a lot of good kind of buy-in just from even outlining these are the things that I think you care about and validating that at the beginning of the call. Now, the second point in this is just because you're having these conversations, eliciting this feedback, and going for ultimate buy-in from each of these stakeholders does not mean that you need to incorporate every little piece of feedback that you get along the entire process. That is not possible in most scenarios, and it can be very difficult to do. And in a lot of ways, it's not the right thing to do. As product people, we have to go through and prioritize. We have the 80-20 rule, 80% of value versus 20% of value. You really focus on the big bang, what's providing the most value up front. And some stakeholders can give feedback that is appropriate and does make sense, but doesn't need to come out in an MVP. It can be incorporated down the line. Some stakeholders can have conflicting views, and you can kind of decide to table it until later in a iteration and decide if you're going to incorporate it at all. The main thing here is that everyone wants to be heard. True in life and true in work. You don't need to incorporate everything, but you need to hear people's perspectives. They want to know that they're being considered. You just need to be respectful in how you're receiving and communicating back and forth about this. Now, of course, product sits in the middle of everything, at least from my perspective, and I'm very biased having worked in product for so long. But I will say, because of that, and because we're sitting in between the execution on the engineering side, the design and the user experience, marketing, customer support, all these different areas we interact with, and we need their support, we need their buy-in, and we're kind of those intermediaries trying to make sure that everything works and everything coalesces together wonderfully. And by saying all this, I really mean to say these meetings specifically for getting buy-in and kind of these trade-off conversations are really more of an art than a science. Many different personalities come into play, but the more prepared you are, the easier these conversations will go, and the less likely you are to have strong opposition down the line, because that's one of the worst things that can happen in the execution of a product is getting months in thinking you have a finalized design when one stakeholder raises their hand and says, I don't agree with that. Let's start over. And you lose months of progress because you didn't pull that one person in earlier or get their buy-in earlier. So this is all to make sure everybody's moving forward together. After you go through all this alignment, you're moving forward, you want to map out and curate your update communications, both in pre-launch, so while you're going through the process, and post-launch. Now, everybody, when they think about updates on an initiative, they always think post-launch, but I would say both are equally as important for a couple different reasons. You can maintain kind of that rapport that you've established in the pre-launch section before getting to post-launch even, and your stakeholders will all know that you have everything covered, and they're going to be a lot less stressed out about the process throughout. So the things that you have to figure out when you're establishing and curating these communications are, The format. Number one, is this going to be an email communication I send out? Is this going to be a meeting where I pull certain people in? Or is this going to be a recording? Personally, over the years, I used to do emails, occasionally would do meetings. I would say that's less ideal because then you're fighting schedules and everything. But now I really love recording updates. And I think, you can supplement some written, so you can have an email written component. But I think a recording update really allows you to articulate things a little bit faster and more clearly to your stakeholders. And it's going to be offline. So it doesn't need to fit into people's schedules. They can watch it whenever they have the time. And it's respectful in that way. So first thing, what's the format going to be? Next is who is going to receive it. So who are you actually tailoring this to? Who's going to receive that? What's the cadence? Am I sending this out weekly? Am I sending this out monthly? Am I doing it every day? Like, it can be based off of how visible the initiative is. It can be based off of how, I would say, important this initiative is to the organization. So you need to figure out your cadence. And then lastly, based off of who's going to receive it, what information are you going to convey? So it's okay to look at this and say, there's not a one size fits all for this type of update. It's okay to have different formats and cadences for different stakeholders. And honestly, the bigger your organization is, the better it is to actually bifurcate these and tailor them to specific needs. So for example, your cross-functional communication update could be with a specific group with more tangible, detailed information. And that's going to be like pre-launch, going through, making sure your cross-functional stakeholders are all aligned and they can follow you through the process. There can also be another update, say, that's sent out monthly. And that's going to be up to leadership, those decision makers, so that they can follow along and be like, oh, okay, everything's progressing. And it'll be a different set of information. Both of those are okay. Both of those are great. The larger your organization is, the more beneficial it might be actually to bifurcate those types of communications. Now, again, reiterate it constantly. Ask yourself, who is the audience and what is important to them? Always tailor it back to what is important to that stakeholder. That's going to resonate. It's going to be beneficial. You're going to gain respect for that. Now, lastly in this, I will say it is best practice to include tangible metrics to track your progress or your product's progress, depending on if you're pre-launch or post-launch. So I generally like to have green, yellow, red light indicators for each metric so that stakeholders can quickly see and understand if something's going to be of concern. And now, again, I mentioned in the beginning of this video, there is going to be a part 2. So I'd say hang in tight for the next session. We'll talk more about changing direction, and that really ties into this portion here, where if you are working towards getting something out, that execution phase or post-launch, when you're seeing that the metrics aren't coming into plan, or a new person has come in, a new competitor has come in and just totally wiped out the TAM that you were hoping to get, things change again. So it's really about making sure you're monitoring the right information, and then you have the right indicator and kind of flip switch of saying, okay, we've hit that point where we need to reevaluate where we are and how to move forward there. So I hope this has been beneficial to you. Again, absolutely an art, absolutely essential for product people and product leaders to be able to bring people along the journey and to be able to get that buy-in and make sure that you're not creating roadblocks for yourself down the line. As always, I would love to hear your comments on this video. I really hope that it was helpful. Please leave comments and continue to facilitate the conversation, and stay tuned for the next one. Thank you.